I love stories, and I love stories that have to do with healthcare because that's the context in which I'm familiar with. And I wanted to open up with this story of a nurse who shared a story of faithfulness because I wanted to share the Bible story of Joseph. And it's a story of a young man who went from a pit to the highest palace in the world at that time. But it's a story of faithfulness. And this story of the nurse is one of faithfulness as well. It was a busy morning, approximately 8:30 a.m., when an elderly gentleman in his 80s arrived to have his stitches removed from his thumb. He stated that he was in a hurry as he had an appointment at 9 a.m. Now, any of you who have gotten to the doctor at 8:30 and needed to be somewhere at 9 a.m., no, that's a dream, right? There's no way that a doctor's visit's going to take 30 minutes. I took his vital signs and had him take a seat, knowing it would be well over an hour before someone would be able to see him. But I saw him looking at his watch and decided, since I was not busy with another patient, I would evaluate his wound. On exam, it was well healed, so I talked to one of the doctors, got the needed supplies to remove his sutures and redress his wound. While taking care of the wound, we began to engage in conversation. I asked him if he had a doctor's appointment this morning, as he was in such a hurry. The gentleman told me no, that he needed to go to the nursing home to eat breakfast with his wife. I then inquired as to her health. He told me that she had been there for a while and that she was a victim of Alzheimer's. As we talked and I finished dressing his wound, I asked if she would be worried if he was a bit late. He replied that she no longer knew who he was, that she had not recognized him now in 5 years. I was surprised and asked him, "And you still go every morning, even though she doesn't know who you are?" He smiled as he patted my hand and said, "She doesn't know me, but I still know who she is." Faithfulness. Doesn't this story remind you of a faithful God who is always present? Even when we forget him, when we're not faithful, he's always faithful, even when we forget him. The second story is my story, and I'm going to be very brief on this story. I was born in East LA. Any East LA folks here? Okay, East Los. I was born, you would think, when I start this at Loma Linda, people say, "Oh, you must have been born at the White Memorial." Nope, I was born across the freeway. County General, right? Any County General folks here? USC? No? Okay. White Memorial? No? Yeah, one White Memorial. Where were you born, Gabe? Oh, Doctor's Hospital. Okay, excellent. But I was born right in that big building where they filmed General Hospital. When I say that to my students, they look at me with these blank stares. General Hospital, what is that? Is it on Netflix? I was born to an immigrant mother that worked as at the White Memorial as a housekeeper. My mother had to make some difficult decisions, and I'm going to abbreviate this, between God and family. When she chose God, we were a year old. She had been baptized into the Spanish American church right across the street from the White there. The church that was famous for being moved with a semi-truck. They moved it like 8 blocks. Those decisions meant she would raise a son on her own, working, going to school, and raising this energetic and sometimes mischievous boy. What made the difference in our lives was church and education. And I always say it's easier for us to have moved from East LA to her home country of Ecuador and then ended up in Loma Linda than if I would have gone straight from East LA to Loma Linda. How many immigrants do we have in this church? Okay, I was trying to read the names, and I love trying to guess last names. I saw some names that looked Nigerian. I saw some names that looked Kenyan. and I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but I think we're all immigrants, right? Unless you're Native American, right? I think everyone's hand should go up when I say how many immigrant families do we have, because we're all immigrants in this land. And as Christians, we're all migrants who are just passing through, correct? So the advantages that we receive by joining the church, beyond salvation and the spiritual growth and everything, the sociological impact of the church community on families is amazing. A community that looked after us. The church made us part of a community that looked after us, promoted education, strong values, and among those values was the value of faithfulness. And there is a memory verse that my mother would always share with me growing up. And it's found in Matthew 19:29. And it says, "And everyone that has left houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit eternal life." And this is a verse that was core to my upbringing and my development as a child. And when I work with immigrant families, I think about this verse too, because immigration is not always the first choice. We always think everyone wants to come to America, right? Everyone wants to come to the United States. But when you look at leaving family, leaving your roots, leaving your culture, it's not an easy thing. So I always think of this verse and think when we leave certain things, comforts, even family, for God's, to follow God, then we shall inherit eternal life. So my favorite story in the Bible is this inspiring story of Joseph from the Old Testament, a narrative of resilience and faithfulness. Joseph was an immigrant. Joseph had to deal with a lot of adversity since he was a child. You know the story. Joseph's journey from betrayal to blessing teaches us profound lessons about God's faithfulness and the power of forgiveness. I always think about how often we carry these grudges with us and how they weigh us down, and how forgiveness is liberating to us even more than it is to the people we're forgiving, correct? And in church communities, I mean, we're families, and families are not perfect. Families have tensions, they have situations that require forgiveness, so we have the opportunity to forgive. We could, and during COVID, I think a lot of churches felt the shift of people just not coming in person anymore, right? And a lot of us, I remember during COVID, we would do the church marathon. I mean, we did, East Coast churches in the morning and then West Coast churches in the afternoon. And we did Oakwood Church and enjoyed the music there. And then we had a church out in Maryland that we listened to. And then our son was up at Walla Walla, so we'd listen to Walla Walla Church and then finish off with Randy Roberts at the end. And it was just all these, churches, and you could just tune in and then click the button and you were back at home and didn't have to deal with people, right? And you were still receiving a blessing from the sermon, but church is much more than what you get from the pulpit. Church is community, and community is messy. And we see in Joseph's life that Joseph's family was messy. I mean, Jacob did some things that, my goodness, he had to pay for the rest of his life, right? So this story of immigration, family drama, struggle, and success is very relatable to many of us. It begins with a young man favored by his father and gifted with dreams of greatness. A lot of times we have dreams as immigrants. A lot of times that's what drive us to move, to uproot, to have this dream of offering something to our children and our great grandchildren that is more than what we've been able to have. And now as a grandfather, I can talk about grandchildren. But how many of us have had big dreams? Sometimes our dreams don't match other people's dreams, and that puts us in conflict, right? Sometimes people think, and they might tell you, and the young people today that we're being recognized, maybe somebody's told you at some point, that dream is too big. You need to scale it down and really bring down your expectations. But as a church, we have a God that believes in great expectations for us. He has no limits for us. And I think that's the beauty of churches that encourage their young people. At LOU, we have students known as dreamers. Speaking of dreams. And I've met with several of our dreamers. And you would think, dreamers, and you're familiar with the term dreamers, who are our students who are dreamers. They were brought here by immigrant parents who are undocumented, but all they know is this culture. They don't speak other languages often. They've been raised here in the U.S., but they are not documented here in the same way. They're not citizens, basically. So we have dreamers who are in our schools of nursing, our schools of public health. We have dreamers who are preparing to be physicians. And the burden that dreamers carry, they can't take loans out like everyone else. They can't take federal loans out. There's no access to that. So they have to find individual loans, private loans. And those loans come with very high interest rates. Dreamers are often set apart from the rest of the community, feeling isolated and alone. And so they're starting to create a group on campus, and I've been meeting with them and hearing about, their stories. We have one young woman who's in medicine right now. Actually her family came from an African country, and somehow almost the entire family got their papers, and she was left out of that process. And she's been able to, make it as a nurse and heal and take care of our community, and now is in medicine and still dealing with some of that. But in Joseph's case, his dreams led to his brothers' jealousy that led them to betray him, throwing him into a pit and selling him into slavery. So Act 1, Joseph's in the pit. Imagine Joseph's plight in the pit, abandoned and betrayed by those closest to him, by his own blood. Yet even in that darkness, God was faithful, shaping his character and preparing him for a remarkable journey ahead. Sometimes God's plans for us may lead through valleys of despair. And I'm sure that many of you have either been through or are going through a valley of despair currently. And I think that's the beauty of community, of gathering at church, is that we can encourage each other when our brothers and our sisters are going through those valleys of despair. Sometimes God's plans for us aren't the way we imagine, but he promises to never leave us nor forsake us because he is faithful. You've heard of PTSD, right? Especially after the pandemic. There's PTSD that's related to going to war, coming back, and having seen things and experienced things that are unmentionable. That messes with our mental health. And we see veterans who struggle with PTSD, can't sleep, have mental health breakdowns. But recently, I've been introduced to something that is much more uplifting than PTSD, and that is PTG, post-traumatic growth. And mental health specialists are looking into post-traumatic growth. And I would say the immigrant experience is often one full of post-traumatic growth, because the trauma of uprooting yourself from a place where you knew everyone, you knew the customs, you knew the language, you knew the culture, and then going to a new place and growing in that place is one of post-traumatic growth. Dr. Margarita Alegría from Columbia University does research on mental health among immigrant families. And what she has found, and this was very interesting, the older you are in migrating to the United States, the less of an impact it will have on your mental health. The younger you are, the more mental health stress you're going to have. So even though the younger you are, the quicker you are to adopt the language, you can speak without an accent, et cetera, you assimilate, you acculturate. But if you come, especially, and her research shows this, especially if you come non-educated and in a lower socioeconomic status, the mental stress is much greater when you're younger moving to this country, because you have a lot more time to adapt. So PTSD, psychologists Richard Teshy and Lawrence Calhoun are the ones who really came up with this term, post-traumatic growth, because PTSD is a process that can lead to post-traumatic growth, or some folks can go straight from trauma to growth without the PTSD phase of it. Some people can move past that PTSD and use their trauma as an opportunity for growth. Others stay stuck in that PTSD. But let's look at the ones who are able to move into that growth. These researchers have found 5 criteria or characteristics. 1 is having relationships with others. 2, thinking of new possibilities. In other words, hope. When you have a sense of hope, and that's what a relationship with Christ gives us, is a sense of hope, you're more able to go into this post-traumatic growth and overcome that trauma. Also, personal strengths. Individuals have different personalities and different strengths. These researchers identified spirituality also as something really important to overcome trauma. And then finally, the appreciation of life, so gratitude. Let's think about within the church context, relationship with others. The church gives us that. New possibilities. There's always that hope of something better in our future, right? The end on this earth is not the end for eternity. Personal strengths, we can build our personal strengths just in participating in church. I always love churches that include our young people, our children, in building their personal strengths. Spirituality, we grow together spiritually here. And the appreciation of life, which is something that God gives us. So our church community assists with all of these things. An integral part of post-traumatic growth theory is the idea that transformation occurs not despite the trauma, but as a direct consequence of the trauma. In other words, the growth could not have occurred without that trauma. And although I don't believe, my theology doesn't think that God gives us suffering. He walks with us through the suffering and helps us come out stronger on the other side. So let's move with Joseph onto the second part of his life, and that is Joseph in prison. From the pit, Joseph was sold into Potiphar's house, where he served diligently. And this is for our young people. I always tell my students, no matter how small the task that you're given, do it 120%, because people are going to notice, and you're going to be able to be promoted and be chosen for other opportunities. So Joseph was diligent, even if he was sweeping the jail cell. But he faced this was before prison. So he was at Potiphar's house. He faced unjust accusations, and you know the story. that landed him in prison. Despite his circumstances, Joseph remained faithful, and God's favor was upon him. In prison, Joseph interpreted dreams foreshadowing his rise to prominence. So we see Joseph in the pit first, later in prison, and in prison, no matter how small the task, he did it with excellence. I always talk to my students about the type of student I hire, because I also hire some of our graduates to work in our Institute for Community Partnerships. And out of a team of about 20, I would say about 15 of them are graduates from our programs. And I always say there's 3 categories of students that I've worked with. One is you give the student a task and it may or may not happen. You just have to hope that they do it. That's not the biggest group of students, though. I would say that's the smaller group. The biggest group are Group B, which you give them a task and they do exactly what you tell them. And they turn in their assignment, they do their work, and it's on time. But it's Group C that I hire, and I always tell students, this is the type of student that I look for. You give them a task, they do exactly as they're told, but they always add a little bit more. They do a little extra. They come up with new ideas. They're like, this was really good, and I did it. But what about if we do it this way? And they challenge me to think even bigger and broader. And I always tell students, those are the type of students I hire. Group B is the type of students we graduate. Group A are the type of students that may have to repeat. But Group C are the ones we hire. And I feel that Joseph would have been that type of student, always doing that extra work. So Act 3, in the palace. Joseph's faithfulness and ability to interpret dreams eventually brought him before Pharaoh, where he interpreted a dream predicting 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Impressed, the Pharaoh appointed Joseph as second in command in all of Egypt. You have to remember that Egypt was the superpower of that time. And here was an immigrant young man who is now second in command after Pharaoh. In this role, Joseph not only saved Egypt, but also saved Israel and reunited his family and forgave his brothers who had once betrayed him. And I know I'm going through a very long story very quickly, but I want you to think of Joseph in that position. He probably started looking more like an Egyptian, but I'm sure there were times that people asked him, like, you don't quite look like you're from around here. Or your Egyptian has a little something in it that just, you must not be from Cairo at least, right? Imposter syndrome can be real. In higher education, we see this a lot. We see minority students who are in positions that they feel like they must have made a mistake because I don't see a lot of people like me here. Fighting imposter syndrome. What will you do when you arrive at the palace is the question to our young people. Will you feel like you belong? And my message to you is don't forget that God has placed you there in that position to be part of his plan. And don't ever forget that you are a son and a daughter of the King of the universe. So wherever you end up, you belong there. And God has placed you there for a reason. So in conclusion, because I know, I don't know about Spanish church, but I know in university church, there's a very tight, this is when it ends. And if you go over, people start getting restless. Spanish church was a lot more fluid, but we did have to remember our diabetic folks in the audience, and there was a time when they would start handing out juice or something to help them make it through. So I don't know how this church operates, but I will start landing the plane right now, just so for those of you who are starting to think about lunch. So in this special education Sabbath, let's remember not just the importance of education and where it can take us, but the why of education. Why do we go to educate? Is it just for the degree or to be able to wear this? I hope not, because it's not that comfortable. Ellen G. White has a whole book on education. And I was being reminded about there's so much in that in education that I encourage you to read. But I would like to share one quote from Education, page 15 and 16, where Sister White says, to restore in man, this is the purpose of education, to restore in man the image of his maker, to bring him back to the perfection in which he was created, to promote the development of body, mind, and soul, that the divine purpose in his creation might be realized. This was to be the work of redemption. This is the object of education, the great object of life. Now, when you think about education, a lot of times we think of schools, universities, colleges. But where does education begin? In the home. That is, so there are three pillars of education: the home, the school, and the church. And the most important of those three pillars is the home. And a lot of times we expect our teachers to do what we're not doing at home. And we get frustrated with our teachers. And it's like, something has to be done at home before we start asking anyone, our pastors and our teachers, to do what we're not doing at home. So it is in the home that the education of a child is to begin. This is in Child Guidance, page 17. Let's make sure all three of these pillars are strong, but especially the main pillar, which is the home. Without a strong home environment, it's difficult to have strong schools or churches or society. If you start looking at the issues we have in society, it usually starts in the home. So how do we strengthen that? And I think the church can help with that. So let me end my story that I started at the very beginning. My mother's decision to join the SDA church transformed our family's life and future. Because of church, she was given a scholarship to study her master's degree at Walla Walla University, and many years later, it's never too late, completed her doctoral degree at Andrews, 6 months before I finished my doctorate. So she beat me. We're in a race, and she beat me. Si se puede, with God's help, yes, we can. And my mother is actually here in the back. You want to wave? My mother is, that's Dr. Norma Alban. She's actually the education coordinator for all the Spanish churches in the Southeastern California Conference, and organizes programs like this one all over the conference. So when I told her what I was doing today, she's like, well, I can't miss that. So yes, we can. With God's help, we can do this. Joseph's story is a testament to God's faithfulness and the transformative power of forgiveness. Despite betrayal, hardship, and injustice, Joseph remained steadfast in his faith, ultimately becoming a source of salvation for his family, his country, and others. And we always think of faithfulness as being kind of this one way, like us being faithful to God, which is very important. But we also have to remember that we have the greatest role model, and that's God's faithfulness to us, right? And so it's this two-way thing. So I would just like to end with lessons from Joseph's story, which are 4. When you're in the pit, always look up. Keep your eyes on God. Number 2, do your best even in the small tasks. A lot of times we think, this is just so insignificant. I'm just going to, do whatever. And when I get like that big promotion, that's when I'm going to really shine. It starts in the small tasks. Number 3, don't forget where you are from and where you come from. Joseph didn't forget Israel when he was in Egypt, even though he was wearing eyeliner and shaved his head. He didn't forget his people. His brothers, I'm sure, didn't even recognize him at first, right? But he never forgot who he was. Number 3, don't forget. Oh, that was number 3. Don't forget where you're from. Number 4, use your success to bless others. When we think of success, it shouldn't be the car and the house and the vacations. That will leave you empty. When we think of success as a way to bless others, that will lead to a life that will be fulfilling, and true wealth will come from that service to others. And true education will prepare our young people for a life of service. So as we reflect on Joseph's journey, let us remember that God can turn even the darkest moments of our lives into opportunities for his glory. Joseph's faithfulness to God was a reflection of God's faithfulness to Joseph. Let us remain faithful and use our success to bless others. Congratulations to all the graduates and the families who have supported these graduates and the church family who has continued to support them. May God bless you, and may you remain faithful to him.